I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as President Zelensky claims Ukraine has liberated 160 square kilometres in a counteroffensive operation in Donetsk, we hear live from Istanbul for the final speech of an old spymaster before their retirement. Then we bring you another recording from David Knowles, who speaks to a witness to the murders which took place in Bucha, and asks what it takes to document and prosecute such a war crime.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, the 19th of September, 3 years and 209 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, dialing in from Istanbul, and the Telegraph's Chief Foreign Analyst, Roland Oliphant, here with me in London. Later, you'll hear David Knowles and Adélie Pojzman-Pontay's recording from Ukraine last year. First, though, over to Roland for a summary of the major military updates.
Headlines first. Volodymyr Zelensky said yesterday, shortly after we'd recorded actually, so we didn't get this in, that Ukraine has liberated 160 square kilometres in a counter-offensive operation in Donetsk region. Now, this is a reference, we think, to the counter-offensive that we talked about and the encirclement of Russian forces around Dobrapilya, which is the outcome of that, what we thought was a big Russian breakthrough at the time. So the details we have at the moment, they spent the past month pushing Russian troops back after that 15 to 20 kilometre, roughly 6-mile advance towards Dobrapilya to cut the Dobrapilya-Kramatorsk highway. This is just north of Pokrovsk. And since late August, Ukrainian units have regained control of multiple villages in the area. Zelensky was citing a report from Alexander Siersky as he reported that. And as I mentioned before, other sources today talking about those alleged encirclements. We're talking about 3 different encirclements, apparently, of Russian troops. Meanwhile, Russia's defense ministry has said today that it's taken control of 2 more villages, one the village of Muravka in Donetsk region and Novoivanivka in the neighbouring Zaporizhzhia region. That's TASS news agency reporting from this morning's Russian Ministry of Defense reporting. Those are movements on the battlefield. Elsewhere, a fragment of a Russian Gerber drone has apparently washed ashore in Latvia. And fragments of a missile, possibly used to down a Russian drone, were discovered in Poland. So this is the piece of a tail section of a Gerber drone found near the Latvian village of Varvie in Ventspils, which is the western part of the country. Defence Minister Andris Sprudz says that apparently the debris does not contain any explosives. This is the same model that crossed into Polish airspace on September the 10th. Not quite sure where these fragments originated from. Ukrainian military intelligence, the HUR, their special forces carried out a raid on the Tendra Spit off the coast of the occupied part of Kherson. They say that they destroyed something called a Vityaz multi-purpose tracked vehicle, a D-10. Tendra Spit is one of those very narrow sand shoals in the northern Black Sea, southwest of Kherson Oblast. It was soldiers from the Viking Maritime Operations Center conducting the landing to lay minefields along the Spit and the mission. Context there, the Center for Defense Strategies is talking at the moment about a big Russian campaign to clear the Ukrainians off all of the islands in the delta of the river and eventually to establish a bridgehead on the Ukrainian side of the Dnipro. And there's been fighting for control of those islands pretty much throughout the war. Just a few more. Russian forces attempting to advance in Kupiansk, which we talked about yesterday, how that battle has actually got into the north, very northern section of the town. Interestingly, the Russian forces there are apparently commanded by a former Ukrainian officer. This is Lieutenant General Sergei Storozhenko. BBC News Ukraine says that he's running Russia's 6th Combined Arms Army there. He was born in Kharkiv Oblast in 1975 and defected during the occupation of Crimea, as quite a few Ukrainian officers and men did at the time. just a couple more things. Putin claimed yesterday that there are over 700,000 Russian soldiers on the front line. Valery Gerasimov, Chief of the General Staff, claimed Russian forces are advancing on practically all fronts. That does more or less reflect our reports yesterday that the Russians are making those incremental gains. But as we reported yesterday in that detailed report, at least in two spots, Dobropilya, we just mentioned, but also up in Sumy Oblast, the Ukrainians are putting in pretty successful counter-offensives. And I just wanted to just touch on one political development, which I think is very interesting. Dmitry Kozak, Putin's chief of staff, has resigned, apparently forced out. Kremlinology, it's always very difficult to know what's going on behind the scenes. But Kozak has previously been reported to have, he was born in Ukraine for one thing, Soviet Ukraine as it was then. He's apparently been one of the voices who kind of advised Putin against the invasion. And there are reports around that he has been pushing the Kremlin for real talks with the Ukrainians. Either way, he's out. And if those reports are true about him perhaps being one of the voices on the inside saying, look, this has gone on too long, or this is not a bad idea, that would suggest his departure means, well, the Russians are not going to change course anytime soon. I think I'll leave it there for military updates.
Well, thank you very much, Roland, for jumping in there and doing those today. Dom, over to you, dialing in from Istanbul. Dom, you had to fly over there at short notice. Who are you seeing?
Well, hello, Francis. Hello, everybody. Yes, I'm in Istanbul airport at the moment, on my way back. I've come over here for two reasons, really. It was the leaving speech of Sir Richard Moore, the head of MI6, the Secret Intelligence Service. Leaves at the end of this month, hands over to Blaise Metrovelli on October the 1st. So it was his leaving speech, and also he was doing a big announcement about a dark web portal that MI6 have launched to enable people to send sensitive information from anywhere around the world via a Tor, via the Onion router, via a secure connection, so they can try and track spies everywhere around the world. As they say, it's getting harder and harder to actually meet in person, so doing it via the dark web is seen as the way ahead. So yeah, I got out here yesterday for reasons that I still haven't quite been able to unravel. The firm booked me 2 return tickets, so if anybody fancies a return flight to Istanbul, trot along to Telegraph Towers right now, because there's a return airfare going begging. But yeah, so there's two return tickets, managed to get me out here. Got here last night. First thing that happened was I was invited out to dinner with the team from MI6, which was very, very nice. It's been a long time since I've been in Istanbul. I was looking forward to enjoying a typical Turkish dinner and whatever. No, we went to an Italian restaurant. I really understand that, but we had pizza, which was very nice, but not quite the sort of introduction to Istanbul I was hoping for. I did, however, stay on the Efes rather than going for the vodka martinis, but I do quite like an Efes. Anyway, I was staying quite near the Hagia Sophia, the Grand Mosque, which was lovely, listening to the call to prayer last night and this morning. I do quite like that, even though it was bloody early in the morning. And then off to the British consulate for Richard Moore's leaving speech. So, as I say, I'll come on to the dark web thing in a minute, what they're calling silent courier. But in his speech, as you'd expect, it was a bit of a tour around all the threats facing Britain and the world. Now he's majoring on Russia, although he did touch on quite a lot of other things, really. China, Iran, Syria, etc., but majored on Russia and the war in Ukraine. And he was saying how he says MI6 has been at the forefront of efforts to support the Ukrainians in their self-defense. That builds on a speech when I went to Paris last November. He was talking about how MI6 has been using covert action with the Ukrainians in their fight. Unsurprisingly, he didn't elaborate on that point then, and he didn't elaborate on it today, but says they've been at the forefront of efforts to support the Ukrainians in their self-defense. Talking about Putin, he said, I have seen absolutely no evidence that Putin has any interest in a negotiated peace short of Ukrainian capitulation. He is stringing us along. So we kind of knew this is what we've been talking about, but to actually hear it from the head of a spy agency like MI6 on the record was quite interesting. And he said, this is a quote, in the end, if we hold our nerve, Putin will need to come to terms with the fact that he has a choice to risk an economic and political crisis that threatens his own rule or make a sensible deal. He said, Putin has bitten off more than he can chew. He lies to the world, he lies to his people, perhaps he even lies to himself. We should not believe him or credit him with the strength that he does not have. He said Putin is mortgaging his country's future. Russia's economy and demography and its means to project imperial power are in long-term decline, and Putin's war is accelerating this decline. Greater powers than Russia have failed to subjugate weaker powers than Ukraine. So, pretty punchy stuff. You might say, well, it's quite easy for him to say that, but this is a very, very senior official on the record, as I said, and yes, he's outgoing, but he has been very consistent in those kind of messages. It was quite interesting. We had a sort of brief huddle off the record afterwards. Didn't elaborate on anything now. I'm not going to talk about what we spoke about off the record, but I thought that was quite a punchy speech. And then on this silent courier thing, now you'll notice if you have a look at the verified MI6 website on their YouTube channel and also their Instagram channel, you'll see what this is. Essentially using the dark web to be able to speak directly to an officer in MI6. So it's not been done before by the Brits. The CIA have been doing it since 2023, I think, a version of 2023, not without incident. CIA had a bit of a problem. Their tech was compromised in China, and they lost quite a few agents in China, we understand. But I think other than that, they've sort of improved it since then, and that's the model upon which this MI6 portal is based. But it's very interesting. So they're calling it Silent Courier. As I say, there's a nice snazzy little film to go with it. Do go and have a look. It's quite good. We've got it on now. I wrote the news piece yesterday. I wrote it up for news yesterday. So we've got the short video attached to that piece. So do go and have a look at that if you wish. And there's the longer video on their website. It's quite interesting. But in his speech today, Richard Moore sort of talking about all that stuff and virtual private networks and all the rest of it, I sort of got a little bit, the tech was a little bit baffling. But anyway, I was hanging on to his ankles. But he did then say at one point, he appealed to, quote, Russians disillusioned and dismayed by Putin's agenda, come spy with us. And then he finished that line by saying, come spy with us, just like your grandparents and parents did. And I thought that was particularly interesting. He's basically saying this idea, this myth that Putin has, that all Russians always love the Soviet Union and would put up with any hardship, and they relish in the hardship and would stick it to the West. Not always the case. A lot of people did not like what Stalin was up to and were helping MI6 and others, and he's appealing to them, but not only appealing to that spirit, but when he says just like your grandparents and parents did, he's basically giving permission. Or he's saying to Russians disillusioned with Putin today, you have your forebears' permission to come and talk to us. I thought it was a really interesting, quite subtle note there, but I thought that was quite an interesting part of his speech. Of course, whether or not it works, you and I will never know, but I did think that stuck out a little bit. And then that was it. Then he sort of, whisked off back into the shadows, or maybe he's leaving the shadows because he's retiring. But anyway, there's some shadows and there's Richard Moore and they're dancing around each other. He said, I'm now hanging up my cloak, returning my imaginary dagger to its scabbard and handing over my famous green pen. And that was it. He was off. The famous green pen reference in 1909, when the Secret Intelligence Service was started by Sir Mansfield Cumming, a naval officer, he always used to write in green ink. And the tradition is that C, the chief of MI6, still continues to write in green ink on formal letters and also in emails. So his emails are typed in green colour, which is quite a funny touch, I think. Anyway, and that was it. Then he's off. He was away. Blaise was here as well, Ms. Metrovelli. She was here. She takes over, as I say, on October the 1st. She's going to be the 18th chief of MI6, the first woman appointed to the role. MI5 had a couple of women as director over there, MI5, but this is the first woman in charge of MI6, so quite interesting to see. Although, actually, Sir Richard he was talking about work undone, and he said he was disappointed to see that he leaves with 40% of the staff in MI6 as women. He wanted to get that statistic higher. And he said ethnic minority representation is just under 10%, so, not a lot. And I know from earlier speeches a couple of years ago that he really wanted to try and improve that. So got quite a lot of work there left to do for MI6, but other than that, the speech was a bit of a tour de force, and then finishing off with an appeal for Russians, anybody, but in particular Russians, to come and spy for MI6 through this new dark web portal, the Silent Courier. And that's it. Now I'm just about to head off and grab one of my 4 flights that I've been given by the firm. I'll spread myself over a few aircraft and come back to London this evening. I'll be back with you on Monday, Francis.
Well, thanks very much, Dom. Maybe you can have your vodka martini on the flight. Let's go now into the political realm then. It's been quite a week for espionage news on the whole. Moscow's FSB security service made several claims this week about alleged Ukrainian spycraft. After the broadcast yesterday, they said they caught a saboteur working for Ukraine disguised as an old woman, attempting to assassinate the head of a Russian defence business. It released the photograph of said gentleman dressed in a bonnet and holding a cane after he was arrested along alongside a team of 2 women who the FSB said had prepared the plot on the orders of Kyiv. The plotter had allegedly planted an explosive device on the car after picking it up from a stash in a cemetery used by the co-conspirators. I'm not going to lie, the outfit is pretty convincing, and we'll link to our article in the show notes where you can see it for yourself. Earlier in the week, the FSB also announced the arrest of a 54-year-old Russian woman who had, they said, attempted to blow up its headquarters in Crimea, carrying a religious icon rigged with explosives. But from Moscow rules to Moscow's rule, as Roland says, the Kremlin confirmed yesterday the resignation of Putin's longtime associate and deputy head of its administration, Dmitry Kozak. And I would just add to what Roland said, the Kyiv Independent's published an interesting piece reflecting on his resignation and what it tells us about power in Russia at the moment, and we'll link to that in the show notes. Another interesting piece of news from Moscow is confirmation via South Korea that Putin supplied Kim Jong-un with nuclear reactors that power submarines earlier this year, a reward for North Korea's support for Russia's war in Ukraine. Analysts believe they could help Pyongyang to make a technological leap as it develops that new generation of weapons we've talked about before. Just for context, while North Korea's current arsenal of missiles have the capacity to strike targets thousands of miles away, nuclear submarines would, experts argue, allow Pyongyang to send weapons across the globe, hide them from satellites, and launch them with impunity. That makes them immune to a first strike targeting nuclear forces and would enable North Korea to maintain its capability to retaliate in the event of a nuclear war. Now, the North Korean involvement in Ukraine is still, for me, one of the most extraordinary examples of how the world has, in a sense, been allowed to become far more dangerous as a result of the West not seeking to end the war sharply and decisively within the first year, as many analysts believe was possible. If they had, this relationship, along with many others, such as with Iran, would never have been expanded. And that also weakens the US's hand in the Pacific theatre. We've not yet seen any comment by the Americans on this story, though, as one might expect, President Trump had several other things to say in the past 24 hours on his final day of his trip to Great Britain. He reiterated his line that Putin had let him down, saying the US had solved 7 wars. I thought it was 6. And that Ukraine was the one that I thought would be the easiest to end because of my relationship with President Putin. But he's let me down. He's really let me down. He also told Fox yesterday that the US would help secure peace after the war ended. When I said help by air, I'm talking about security after the war is settled, he said. We would then help secure the peace. And I think ultimately that will happen. Now, again, no sign of shift in any messaging, not that we should expect there to be. In that same interview with Fox, Trump said China would likely force Russia to end its war against Ukraine if Europe imposed sanctions or tariffs on Beijing. If they impose sanctions or tariffs, or whatever you want to call it, if they did that against China, I think the war might be over. China is the biggest buyer of Russian oil. Now, I think we should see this in terms of Trump's own foreign policy agenda rather than a genuine attempt to impede Russia's military actions, just as we should see the secondary tariffs on India in the same light. Now, that's not to say Trump is wrong to be critical of European dependence on China in recent years, who have, as we've said many times, enabled the war and who are hardly friendly actors. Remember that story recently from Sophia Yan about how Chinese suppliers provide the key materials for Russia's drone production. Trump's also been critical of European purchasing of Russian oil and gas, which he's right to say is still ongoing, albeit at a considerably reduced level compared to pre-2022. As we've come to expect, Slovakia and Hungary are a major sticking point on this issue. They explicitly said on Wednesday that they will not bow to pressure from Washington to reduce imports of Russian energy unless the EU secures sufficient alternative energy supplies. That's something that will take years, and that's before one even considers the political obstacles, more of which might well be coming down the road, as the European Commission announced earlier that it's proposed the EU's next package of sanctions targeting Russia. We'll hear more details from Ursula von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas on that later on. But just to end on one more story out of Europe, Antonio Costa, President of the European Council, has just invited European leaders to a meeting in Copenhagen on the 1st of October for what he says is a dual purpose: strengthening European common defence readiness and reinforcing our support for Ukraine. His letter is worth quoting from. He says, "Russia's recent airspace violations in Poland and Romania are a stark reminder that we must accelerate and deepen our efforts. The direction of travel is clear. We are building a Europe capable of responding effectively, autonomously and together to today's and tomorrow's threats. The ambition we have set ourselves to decisively ramp up Europe's common defence readiness by 2030 embodies that commitment. In recent months, we have taken important steps to boost defence spending, support our industrial base, and commit joint efforts on capability development, in particular on enhanced interoperability, joint procurement, and aggregation of demand to achieve scale. Every euro should strengthen our common security and strategic autonomy. Likewise, we need to draw on the lessons from the war in Ukraine, including by strengthening cooperation with the Ukrainian defence industry, drawing on Ukraine's unique experience. I propose we focus on concrete capability steps with the objective of building a shared understanding of what is expected from the EU and member states to meet our 2030 defence readiness target. I suggest our discussion be structured along the following topics: how to deliver faster, support for our eastern flank, governance, namely how we can ensure efficient political oversight and coordination, in particular to track capability gaps and measure progress, and how our security is tied to Ukraine's security. Ukraine's EU accession process must also stay on course. I look forward to seeing you in Copenhagen. So, an interesting intervention by the head of the European Council. Once again, it raises questions about the wisdom, though, of a European strategy which is predicated on future actions, especially after a ceasefire, as opposed to what it can do now to change the balance in the war. That's a subject we turn to again in more detail in this week's newsletter, where we also answer questions you kindly send in to the inbox. And if you're not a subscriber to that, it's completely free and you just need to go into the show notes for this episode and you'll find it. And now we're pleased to be able to bring you another of the documentaries David was working on before he passed away a year ago this month. In this segment, David and Adélie talk to a resident of Bucha who tells the story of how her neighbours were murdered when trying to escape. That case is among those being documented for The Hague as potential war crimes, and David looks more deeply into what it takes to document and prosecute one. Thank you to all of you who've already donated to one of the two charities fundraising in David's memory this month: HARP, a charity which rebuilds homes in Kharkiv Oblast, and the British Heart Foundation. We'll link again to both in the show notes.
So we're here in Bucha now to speak to the neighbours of a man who lost his entire family, his wife and his children, during the Russian occupation. He is obviously too distressed to talk to us, but his neighbours have decided that they can share what they saw.
Любов.
Means love. Любов. Lyubov and her husband lived in Bucha throughout the Russian invasion. She started by telling us her own experience of that fateful morning. Svetlana, our fixer, translated for us.
Мы как раз там были, и 24-го вот это ж проснулись. Эти ракеты, эти бомбы, это все летело. Вот. А 25-го или 26-го, я уже не помню, я стою на кухне там.
So, the 24th of February, I was here. I woke up as everyone with missiles, rockets and explosions everywhere. And 24th, 25th, 26th, we were basically staying in our flats, not going out. And then on the 26th, suddenly from my window, I saw Russian tanks everywhere. And Russian tanks like coming row by row and then shooting everyone.
Я ужаснулась, мужу кричу: смотри, стреляют. Я говорю, если бы ребенок там шел.
I saw that I was screaming to my husband, saying like, look, they're like shooting on like civilians. Can you imagine if there will be children there?
Тоже, но все равно подстреливают. Потом я видела, как рыли вот эти траншеи, как свозили трупы, эти, как сбрасывали.
Once she was in her flat and she saw from the balcony that Russians were digging trenches in this churchyard, and where they afterwards started to put bodies of people they shot down here.
So we're just outside Lyubov's house, and we can see on the sort of an abandoned car outside, and there's bullet holes still there. So on our left is the sort of central church in Bucha, which I think many people will know because, of course, it was in the grounds of this church that the Russian forces dug their mass graves.
So Lyubov wanted to tell us the story of the family, Chkmirov family, who on the 5th of March they were trying to evacuate from Bucha.
The Chikmarovs were a family of 4, 2 parents and 2 little boys. There's Alexander, the father, and Margarita, the mother, who in March 2022 was 35 years old. Together, Alexander and Margarita had 2 sons, 4-year-old Klim and 9-year-old Matvey.
Ну, Чикмарёвых как мы знали, они переселенцы, они недавно поселились как бы тут, год назад.
So this family fled Donbass when the war began in 2014, and they came here, and they are living, as you can see, not far away, one from another. This house is basically just like little village, so everyone knows everyone here on the street. Lyubov was seeing Margarita, who is the wife, coming home every day from school with her boys.
It was the morning of March 5th, 2022, early on in the invasion.
At 5 o'clock they decided to evacuate.
В общем, Романовна вылезла, она со свахой была.
Получается, была вот эта семья, и была вторая семья, которая
ехала.
So there were 2 cars, this house and this one. 2 cars, 2 families at 5 o'clock in the morning, and basically the Russians started shooting on them, and the drivers stayed alive, wounded, like really seriously wounded but alive, while the whole passengers behind all were dead. Lyubov actually lost her friend who was in the second car and who was killed as well. And
the execution happened on Lech Kaczynski Street, just around the corner where we met Lyubov. It's one of the bigger avenues of Bucha that gets you to the main road that leads you then out of the city.
By the time neighbors arrived to try to collect his body, they saw that it was like half of his body left, basically.
2 детей. Одному 9, а второму, по-моему, 6 или 5. Я уже забыла, если.
The kids were 9 and 6 years old. The car was on fire afterwards when they shot it. The smallest one, they were not able to identify the rest.
The bodies of Margarita and her 2 children remained in the burnt-out car for 23 days before they were able to be recovered.
Can you tell us what happened next? How did the local community say goodbye to these families?
Их хоронили уже, показывали по телевизору, мы в Черновцах уже видели, как соседка вот стоят возле березки, и это...
То есть они уже еще когда...
Они здесь...
Еще при оккупации.
Да.
So the neighbors had to bury them just under this birch while Russians were still here, and now their bodies are reburied on a cemetery not far away from here where they have a monument.
In the face of this atrocity and countless others like it, what hope is there of bringing perpetrators to justice? To better understand the process and its challenges, David spoke with Wayne Jordash.
I'm a King's Counsel from the UK, but an international lawyer and the managing partner of Global Rights Compliance and the deputy of the Atrocities Crimes Advisory Group in Ukraine. In order to really investigate these cases properly, you need 3 partners. 1 is civil society, 1 is the national prosecution, and 3 is international or foreign experts who've done this before, as I have. If you combine those 3 well, you have a chance of doing effective investigations. If you don't, you will struggle.
Let's start off with a simple question then. What is a war crime, legally speaking, and how is it prosecuted?
A war crime is essentially a serious violation of the Geneva Conventions and other laws or customs of war as defined in the Rome Statute, Article 8. So you have essentially two types of war crimes. The grave breaches, which come from the Geneva Conventions, which include everything from willful killing, torture, deportation of the population, taking hostages, etc. And then you have other violations of the laws and customs of war, as in contained in Article 8 of the Statute of the Rome over the International Criminal Court, which includes a whole range of different crimes, violations of international humanitarian law committed either in an international armed conflict or a non-international armed conflict. So, I mean, put simply, there are laws which must be followed in war where civilians and non-combatants or combatants who've been rendered not able to continue fighting have to be obeyed. And if they're not obeyed and it's serious, then it's likely to be a war crime.
And what has to happen to bring a perpetrator of a war crime to justice?
That's a long conversation in some ways. What should happen is that every country has an international obligation to investigate and prosecute war crimes that happen on their territory. But of course, most countries where war crimes occur, especially at the hands of their own people, their own soldiers, are not likely to do that themselves. And that's when international justice steps in. For example, the International Criminal Court, which is mandated to step in when a particular state is not willing or able to prosecute those crimes themselves. So, for example, in Ukraine, the state is very willing to prosecute war crimes committed by the Russian troops, and there are many. The challenge, of course, though, is getting hold of the evidence and getting hold of the suspects. And in circumstances where the state, like Ukraine, cannot get hold of the suspects, then the International Criminal Court can step in and has jurisdiction to investigate and prosecute those crimes.
Could you tell us a little bit about what you're doing in Ukraine then? What's your work out there?
My work is essentially running mobile teams consisting of national prosecutors and lawyers and international prosecutors and investigators, and essentially supporting the Office of the Prosecution and the regional prosecutors, which are all part of Ukraine's judicial system, in their investigation and their prosecution of international crimes. So we send teams out regularly from Kiev to the regions. They work hand in hand with the regional prosecutors. We develop strategies for the regional prosecutors and for the prosecutors in general. But we go all the way down to advising on how to build a case against commanders, how to interview suspects, how to interview witnesses, and so on and so forth. We are a mobile facility for the prosecution.
And what are the challenges you face doing that? I mean, it's an active war zone. There must be quite a lot of problems you come up against.
Well, there's a number of challenges. I mean, the first is that the number of crimes committed by the Russian military are overwhelming. Any system would be unable to cope with this volume of crimes. That's the first challenge because, of course, Ukraine is still at war. Russia keeps attacking, and the resources that Ukraine can put into the investigation and prosecution of war crimes is limited. So often it feels like we are scratching the surface of the job that needs to be done. And we are 50 strong, but still, we probably need to treble or quadruple that to be able to really provide the support that the prosecution need. So that's the first thing. The second, of course, is that much of the territory is still occupied, and this is where the crimes are ongoing. They're also ongoing in unoccupied territory because the Russians keep sending missiles into civilian targets on a regular basis. And thirdly, I think it's really trying to investigate war crimes is a very specialist endeavor. It's not like investigating ordinary crimes. So to ask a ordinary prosecutor and an ordinary investigator to do that without international support is a very difficult request. And frankly, there's not enough international support for the prosecution in the same way that there isn't enough international support, I think, overall for Ukraine.
What, in your view, is particularly distinct or unique to what Ukraine is facing, as opposed to maybe some other conflicts or conflict zones around the world you've worked in?
I think what's unique is the systematic nature of the crimes. I think most conflicts I've worked in, not all, but most, and I've worked in relation to almost all the modern conflicts that you can think of, from Syria to Yemen to the Rwandan genocide to the breakup of the former Yugoslavia and so on. But what I think is different is that how little of the Russian military effort is actually legitimate warfare. It is essentially a war against civilians. So I say systematic because I think what the Russians want to do is to extinguish Ukrainian identity, and the Ukrainians want to hold on to it. That necessarily means you have to commit widespread and systematic war crimes, crimes against humanity, and maybe even genocide in order to force the population to think as you wish them to think.
What have you learnt over the past 2 years that maybe you didn't expect or is new for you?
I think what I've learned is that a state which is determined to commit crimes on this scale, unfortunately, is able to get away with a lot of it, because with the best will in the world, even with the prosecutors here doing a really good job, really committed, even with some international assistance, in fact, more international assistance than is usual, it feels like we're still scraping the surface of what needs to be done, with no prospect of the suspects being able to be detained. And I have a sinking feeling that the international community, the West, will not insist upon that, the surrender of suspects, as any future peace agreement. So I guess I knew that the notion of international justice is a flawed one, but it really feels like it in this instance. It really drives that point home.
Could you talk us through the sort of granular detail a little bit of this? Could you describe the sort of different stages from the ground up of how these cases are collected and documented, and what do you go through as an advisor, as a prosecutor?
Yeah, I mean, the starting point is obviously to try to understand the crime scene, whether that's a missile landing, what is the type of missile, where did it come from, was it aimed at a civilian target, or did it accidentally hit a civilian target? In relation to other crimes, what you might call occupation crimes, the question is less, was it accidental? The question is more mapping what happened. So mapping the movement of the Russian troops, understanding the response of the Ukrainian troops, understanding the narrative of how the occupation took place, when were detention centers set up, when were houses searched, what happened during the search of those houses, what happened to a group of people which disappeared at the hands of the Russian military. So he's trying to get an overall view as to how events occurred. And then you can start to drill into the specifics of the specific crimes. So what happened in the detention centers, interviewing the victims of the detention centers or the loved ones of the detention centers, looking at the mass graves, uncovering the mass graves and trying to understand what happened to those people. So what you're trying to do is slowly build up a granular vision of the way in which these crimes occurred. That's the first step, and it's called examining the crime base. You're trying to work out the patterns of crimes.
My name is Roman Koval. I'm an investigator at Hounds. I conduct distinct investigations, and also I'm a field researcher.
Hounds is one of the organizations helping investigate war crimes across Ukraine. They're the civil society branch that Wayne Jordash just mentioned. We spoke to them about a different case, the murder of writer Volodymyr Vakulenko in the east of Ukraine. But a lot of what they had to say and the way they conduct the investigations is still relevant to what happened in Bucha.
Well, basically it's about collecting evidence of international crimes. There are a number of people who work as field researchers, and they spend most of their times working in different settlements. It's conducting interviews, conducting testimonies, collecting physical evidence if possible, for example, pieces of shells and other weapons. And this process of documenting has two aims. The first one is to understand, was this event a documenter and a witness are talking about, was this event a war crime or any other kind of international crime? If yes, if it has signs of a war crime, a documenter must try to figure out who committed it. Sometimes we go from door to door in cases when we don't have any specific information. So sometimes we know that something happened there, and after that, documenters go there and look for evidence. But sometimes when we don't have any specific information, we just know that, I don't know, a bomb fell somewhere in a settlement, and that's all. So in such cases, it really literally looks like going from a door to a door, knocking, saying hello, did you were there back in March, for example, and so on and so on. It's a very practical way to look for witnesses or victims.
And if knocking on doors is one end of the spectrum, the other is a lot more high-tech, as Marina Slobodianyuk, one of Truth Hound's lead investigators, explained to us.
When you speak about verification, how does new media play in that in terms of like social media? Are you trying to cross-reference faces you might see in videos or photographs from the ground with Russian social media, for example?
Well, we use different tools and techniques of OSINT, and social media also helps with these. I wouldn't say there is some good representation of Russian soldiers in social media, so it's not that easy. Like, you know, they have the account in Kontakte showing that he's in a military form and going directly to Kapitolivka to kill Ukrainians. But sometimes it happens. Sometimes they're dull enough to do so, but I think they really had this command to erase everything and not to be that represented into social media. But still, those people have their relatives, their families and friends and stuff like that. So by this indirect path, we can really identify those person using some Telegram bots tools as well. So it's like some cross-platform engines of search for using the tools on facial recognition and search as well. So it's a very complex work which contains all these, tracks and direction of verification.
But even when investigators are able to identify perpetrators, responsibility for these war crimes doesn't end with them. Here's Wayne Jordash again.
Thereafter is the most difficult bit, which is to try to understand who, other than the direct perpetrators, is responsible for those crimes. So I'm talking about links to the commanders. How far does the chain of responsibility go? And that's difficult because you're talking about trying to understand who devised the policies, who implemented the policies, who ordered the commanders into those areas, who allowed those crimes to continue, even though they knew about them. So what you're not looking for often there is illegal orders. What you're looking for is ostensibly legal orders, but which are given with the awareness that it's leading to criminal behavior, and then establishing that despite that awareness, the policy was allowed to continue. And that's how you investigate the commanders, and that's how you link the commanders to the crimes on the ground.
And once you've built the case, what happens then? What are the sort of the pathways, the timeline for taking this forward? I mean, earlier you didn't sound particularly hopeful about bringing some of these perpetrators to justice.
What needs to be done is you need to build robust cases, and that's tricky. Ukraine is 2 years into the full-scale invasion, and it's only just beginning to really start to focus on the commanders and not just the direct perpetrator cases, because it's been overwhelmed with direct perpetrator cases. Trying to investigate, for example, in Kherson, nearly 30 detention centers and torture, sexual violence and so on occurring in those detention centers. That takes a long time to investigate. So you're talking about years to really bottom this out and build robust cases. And thereafter is the biggest challenge. What happens then when you've built a picture? And I've no doubt this can be done because the crimes are widespread and systematic, and therefore it would be highly unlikely that the higher commanders or the higher political and military leaders are not responsible for them. What happens, though, when you build those robust cases? And therein lies the challenge. You can send that information to the International Criminal Court, and maybe they'll be interested in apply for arrest warrants, as they have for Putin and the Commissioner for Children's Rights, so-called. But they may not be interested in them. The International Criminal Court has limited resources, and so it's only going to go against maybe maximum 10 commanders. So then you're talking about national trials. But of course, if you don't have the suspects, you can have a trial in absentia, but there's only so many of them you can do before it loses its legitimacy. So you basically have to sit and wait. That's the bottom line. And when I say sit and wait, you may sit and wait for decades before there's any opportunity to arrest some of those suspects. And the reality is we're always going to be disappointed with the number that are arrested and tried. That's the sad reality.
Identifying and prosecuting perpetrators has become a crucial mission in waging the war on Russia. It's the legal front, and just like the military frontline is changing warfare, these investigations conducted by both the justice system and civil society are drawing new lines. In the 3.5 years since the beginning of the invasion, Ukraine's Prosecutor General Office has documented more than 150,000 alleged war crimes. The General Prosecutor has submitted more than 500 indictments, and Ukrainian courts have sentenced over 100 Russian military officials, often through trials in absentia. Only 19 Russian soldiers, however, have been convicted in person. So where does that leave Lyubov's neighbor, Alexander Chikmarov, who lost his wife and children? What hope is there of bringing the perpetrators to justice?
When you very kindly had a quick look at one of the interviews we did in Bucha with Lyubov, and I know you've only just seen it, so I'd just be curious as to your initial reactions to what she was telling us.
Well, I think, number one, I think I've seen many statements like that. I think life for civilians in territories occupied by Russia is extremely difficult, and was particularly difficult in the early stages of the full-scale invasion. Trying to escape the Kiev suburbs was, I think, genuinely a nightmare for many civilians. Number two, that statement is what I would call, at the moment, context evidence. It, along with other statements, sets the scene for more targeted investigations into more targeted crimes against identified suspects. It's really valuable evidence because when you have sufficient numbers of statements of that kind, you understand that immediately that this was an attack on civilians. There's no other explanation for it. I mean, one statement doesn't give you that full picture, but as I say, I've seen many statements like that. That, in a sense, is your starting point. This was a systematic attack on the civilian population. The next question is, what were the individual crimes committed during that period, in that context, which can be attributed to particular individuals, direct perpetrators plus commanders? So it's valuable contextual evidence, I would say.
The Chikmarov family has actually been one of those early cases that have become prominent in Ukrainian media. Suspilne, the national broadcasting company of Ukraine, published an investigation that identified Russian paratroopers from the 104th Regiment of the 76th Guards Aerosol Division of the Russian Airborne Forces as those who killed Margarita and her 2 young sons, Klim and Matvey. In their investigation, I'll link to it in the show notes, the journalists explain where they started. Near the 2 civilian cars that were burned down and where the bodies were retrieved, there was a BMD-2 tank that the Russians had left behind by the side of the road. From there, they were able to identify the regiment responsible for the execution. And then, a key witness was identified. A Russian prisoner of war, Andrei Medvedev. He was able to help recoup the information both the journalists and the investigators had and identify the commander as well as the gunner-operator involved in the execution. The investigation also found that all crew members returned from the Kyiv region alive. The trial of the combat vehicle operator that shot down the car where Margarita and her 2 sons were started in absentia in Ukraine in December 2024. His name is Mikita Chalov, and his case will be heard in the Irpin City Court. When David and I met Lyubov in February 2024, some sense of normality had returned to her life, but she still lived daily with the fear of what could happen next.
That was nearly 2 years ago now. How do you think the community is recovering or helping each other or surviving now? You're telling your stories, but what's changed in Bucha in the last 2 years?
Сразу мы приехали, конечно, родные места, родные, это все, многие возвращаются, многие было это.
She said, when we actually came back here, it was big happiness, moment of happiness to come back home. Lots of things are renovated and repaired here, and we've been renovated here since the occupation. Unfortunately, we are still quite stressed, and especially today there are lots of rumors that Russians will probably try to come back, and I've heard that trenches are digged in Irpin currently, so we are very much afraid of Russians coming back to our home.
Which is what makes Wayne's work so important.
It's terrible work in one sense. It's emotional work always, but it also feels right, and it feels as though, you know, as a lawyer, it's an opportunity to contribute to Ukraine's defense and resistance.
And that's a sentiment which is echoed by Marina at Truth Hounds.
This is something I would really like to stop investigating, but at the same time, what is even more important for me, just to get this satisfaction of this all hard, sensitive moment, is that the justice will be restored and the executors found and bring into justice and put into jails. So not only the path of pain we would experience, but also the satisfaction that the impunity is broken and those who are guilty, they are finally punished.
Thanks to Adélie and Jack Boswell for their work on that segment. If you wish to donate to one of the two charities in David's memory, we'll link to them in the show notes. But let's go to our final thoughts now. Dom's had to dash off to get his flight back to London, but Roland, where would you like to leave listeners today?
Hello, Francis. Wanted to ask Dom if he'd asked Richard Moore if he's going to be the next ambassador in Washington, because if you tune into this week's Battle Lines, you will see the excellent Rob Crilly, the Telegraph's chief US correspondent, talking about exactly that. He's the guy who's been tipped to replace Peter Mandelson. Is he going to Washington? That's the question. Is he going back to diplomacy? I'm going to ask Dom when he gets back. I was pretty annoyed he had to go. Apart from that, I want to indulge in a bit of self-promotion, if that's okay, Francis. So last week, a week ago, one of our writers, Helen Brown, she's been freelancing for The Telegraph for absolute years, 20 years I think she's been working for us. She's an arts writer. She does profiles of retrospectives of David Bowie and interviews with comedians like Alan Davies and things like this. Well, she was very surprised, got in contact with me the other day, to say, look, my photograph has shown up on the byline on something called not The Telegraph, but the London Telegraph. And the headline of the story that I'm purported to have written under a different name is that Volodymyr Zelensky heads an absolutely enormous, entirely corruptly built $1.2 billion property empire in London and across Europe, an entirely fabricated claim without any stuff. So we started looking into this. Well, it turns out this was the latest effort by Russia's constellation of fake news websites. It was quite a remarkable thing to look into. So there it was, the London Telegraph. The entire thing turns out to have been AI generated by an AI bot, a server operated by a fugitive American police officer who ran away to Moscow in 2017 and now works for a think tank linked to Alexander Dugin, the nationalist philosopher. They are linked in turn to fake news, an online threat network that Microsoft called Storm 1516. Anyway, it's all absolutely fascinating. They now appear to have perfected the art of using their AI bots to scan the internet, not only to just set up random websites that spout news, terrible fonts. I mean, honestly, Francis, our backbench would have had an absolute heart attack if they saw the use of capitalisation on this thing. It was a shame on the Telegraph trying to pretend they're us. But they've tried to be OK Magazine as well, and The Economist and The Guardian. Anyway, they're now scouring the internet and grabbing byline pictures and the identities of journalists to lend more credibility to these spurious claims. Anyway, that's the spiel. I'd encourage you to go and have a look on the Telegraph website. It was, to me, a really eye-opening thing because I hadn't been paying attention to it. But that disinformation cyber war, there is a huge thing that often we're unaware of, and it's coupled with, as I'm sure more plugged-in listeners know, with this constellation of social media such as to amplify it and retweet it with the goal of getting it into the mainstream. So very interesting to see the Telegraph itself briefly dragged into that weird world.
Well, thanks very much, Roland, and we'll certainly link to that in the show notes. I'm just amused at the idea that the AI thought that people who read OK Magazine, not for celebrity gossip, but to learn more about the apparent corruption in Kyiv. Pretty extraordinary. It's amazing. Anyway, thank you all very much for dialing in for now. From Roland and I, and from Dom, wherever he is, goodbye for now. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom, Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.